Thank you very much for joining us for today's expert lecture on the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. My name is Natasha Baker and I'm the Marketing Manager for Golden Eagle Luxury Trains. And I'm thrilled to be welcoming back our much loved guest speaker, Major Gordon Corrigan, to be able to deliver this presentation for you today. Now, some of you may know Major Corrigan served as an officer in the Royal Gurkha Rifles for most of his adult life, and he now is a professional military historian and is the author of a number of books on the First and Second World Wars. We also have a great pleasure of hosting him as a guest speaker on the Golden Eagle train, and I'm delighted to say that he is going to be lecturing on a number of different journeys with us in 2022. So if this is of interest to you, please do get in touch and we'll send you a list of those journeys that he's travelling on with us. So thank you again for joining us, and I will now hand over to Major Corrigan.
Well, Natasha, thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for logging in. I must say that when I started doing these lectures, which is over a year ago now, if anybody had said I'd still be doing them in September 2021, I'd have said, keep taking the pills, you know, it'll all be over before that. And of course, it isn't over just yet, but things are looking up. And I think, you know, we are reasonably optimistic that we'll be back on the wonderful Golden Eagle before too long. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, for Japan, it was the emergence from feudalism into the modern world. And for Russia, it was really a harbinger of what was going to come in 1917. The cause was great power rivalry for control of Korea, control of Manchuria in China, and for access to the Pacific. Now, as far back as 1600, Japan was in chaos. Civil wars happened every weekend, the great men all fighting each other, all with their own little private warlords, total chaos, total anarchy. And eventually, one of these warlords, Ieyasu Tokugawa, who happened to be more powerful than any of the other great warlords and happened to have a bigger and better army than any of the other great warlords, managed to knock everybody's heads together and managed to unify the country and established the shogunate. And the shogunate was a military government headed by the shogun, and that was a hereditary post. It didn't always go father to son, but it always stayed within the same clan, the Tokugawa clan. The emperor of Japan, of course, was still there, but he was, in their terms, above the clouds. So he was a symbol of the nation, but he was powerless. He had no power. All power rested with the military government, with the shogun. And Tokugawa and his successors deliberately enforced isolation on Japan. They closed the country. No foreigners allowed in. It was the death penalty for anybody appearing. Any foreigner who came in was caught, chopped. No emigration. Any Japanese who tried to leave the country and was caught, again, the penalty was death. No missionaries allowed, no Christians. Tiny little bit of trade with China for copper, but otherwise no trade with anybody. Absolutely closed country. And that went on. And it went on for 200 years. It was a feudal society. Each of the lords, before the establishment of the shogunate, they all had their own private army made up of samurais who were a caste of warriors, a hereditary caste of warriors. But of course, once the shogunate was established, there is peace. There is no more fighting. So there really wasn't any work for these samurai to do. And increasingly, the lords couldn't afford to maintain them. And at the same time, there was a rising merchant class. Now, the merchants were, of course, able to trade within Japan. They couldn't trade outside Japan, although they wanted to. And increasingly, the lords were taking loans from the merchants. So most of the lords are in hock to the merchants. They can't afford to maintain their retainers, their samurai. And the problem was that the samurai were forbidden to do any work other, of course, than soldiering, which is what they were bred for. And the only other jobs they could do were they could be intellectuals. Very, very few of them were intellectuals. Or they could be bureaucrats, civil servants. And hardly any had the qualifications or the education to do that. And by the middle of the 19th century, it's estimated that there were something like 40,000 samurai known as lordless men, men who had no lord and who wandered around the country as brigands, robbing and ambushing and behaving as highwaymen. So really by 1850, the system is starting to crumble. You've got on the one hand these brigands, these landless, lordless samurai. You've got the lords who can't afford anymore to maintain the standards that they'd been accustomed to. You've got the merchants more and more wanting to trade with the outside world. You've got the British and the French and the Russians wanting the Japanese to open their ports. And the shogunate government really was decaying. Now, the man who gets the credit for being the catalyst to make Japan open her ports, open the country to foreign influence, foreign investment, was Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy. The United States President Fillmore, was concerned that the British and the French had a monopoly of trade in the Pacific. America was starting to come onto the world stage. She fought the War of 1812 with the British. She had fought the Second Barbary War in 1815. She fought the American and Mexican War in 1846 to 48. And they wanted to get a bit of the possible trade in the Pacific. And Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay in June 1853. And he had 2 paddle steamers and 2 sailing ships. His flagship was the Susquehanna. This is a contemporary Japanese drawing of his flagship. Now, when you think that these artists had never seen a paddle steamer, they've never seen a steamship, they haven't really done too badly. But what Perry had were Paishan's guns. Now, forgive me if I become a bit technical here. Up to this period, ship-on-ship warfare consisted of guns firing a solid shot, a big round ball of iron, and you fired that at the side of the enemy ship and hoped to blow a big hole in it and hope that the ship would either lose way or fill up with water and sink. I mean, that's a simplification, but that's what you're trying to do. A shell, which is a projectile which lands and then explodes, would be a much more effective weapon against ships or indeed against anything. But the problem was that up to now, no gun could fire a shell. I'll explain why in a moment. The only way you could fire a shell at anybody was to fire it from a mortar or a howitzer, which would lob the thing up and down it would come. And when it landed, it went bang. It caused a great deal of damage. And the problem there was that this was no good for ship against ship warfare, because if the ship moved 10 feet, then your shell fell in the sea and was not effective. And the reason why it took so long to develop a gun that can fire a shell, now a gun fires on a flat trajectory, and the force needed to send a projectile out of a gun to give it enough range, keeping it in a straight line. The problem was that this was much more than the force you needed to fire it from a mortar, and the force needed to fire the projectile from a gun exploded the shell in the barrel, or as it just came out of the barrel, and it would kill all the crew. And a lot of people were killed experimenting, trying to develop some way of firing a shell from a gun. And General Henri Joseph Paishan in France developed a system whereby a gun could do this. Essentially what he did was he developed a delay fuse so that the fuse wasn't activated until after the shell had left the barrel. And then it would hit the target, go bang, and cause a huge amount of damage. this system was adopted by the Russian Navy, the French Navy, and the American Navy. The British were working on a parallel system, the Armstrong gun, which essentially did the same thing. And the only difference was that the Armstrong gun was breech loading, whereas the Paysan gun was still muzzle loading. And of course, breech loading gives you a faster rate of fire. Once you have the Paysan gun, once you have a shell which will hit the target and then explode, that's the end of wooden ships. You can't, because a shell that will go through the wall, through the hull of a wooden ship and then explode. I mean, really, that's the end of the ship. And that is why navies then very quickly had to go to ironclad. And in fact, the first ironclad ship was a French ship. They took a wooden ship and they covered it with iron plates. And that took part in the Crimean War in 1854. The British produced the first all-iron ship, HMS Warrior. And actually, you can still see that because it's in Portsmouth. If you have nothing else to do and you can't go to some exotic holiday overseas, pop down to Portsmouth. There's HMS Victory, which is Nelson's flagship. There's HMS Warrior, the first ever all-iron ship. And there's Mary Rose, which was the flagship of Henry VIII, which sank and was raised some years ago. Now, when Matthew Perry trains his guns on his 6 Paisans guns on the Japanese who have flooded to the shore and to the harbour to see what this is, they have no artillery. They're armed with matchlocks and bows and arrows. And it's fairly obvious to them that they're no match for Perry and his guns. And Perry delivers a letter. And it is a letter to the shogun. And it says, we want you to open your ports for trade. I will come back in a year and see if you've done so. And sure enough, he does come back in February 1854. Now, of course, as far as the shogun is concerned and the government, they knew very well, very quickly, they were absolutely no match for Western technology. And they start to open up. And Japan fairly quickly develops again into chaos. There are those who do want to open up and those who don't want to open up, and they're going to war with each other, a civil war again. And in 1867, that civil war leads to what's known in Japan as the Meiji Restoration. And what has happened is that a number of the great men, the warlords, go along to the shogun. He's the 15th shogun. And they say, Shogun, we'd like you to resign. The implication, of course, being that if he didn't resign, they'd kill him. So he resigns. And power is now given to the emperor. And it's the Meiji emperor. His name is actually Matsuhito. So he now has the power, not the shogun. And there is now a huge change in Japan. Japan opens up. The view is if you can't beat him, you join him. The British were brought in to build the railways, to build mills, and to train the navy, not only train the naval officers, but build modern warships in British shipyards. The Dutch came in to build arsenals. The French produced ironworks. The Germans were in to train the army, and incidentally, they introduced the polka, which became very popular in Japan of the late 19th century. The Italians, the Swiss, the Americans, they're all in there. And it's probably the most rapid industrialization from a backward agricultural economy to an industrial economy that's ever happened. And as all these people are working away, these Westerners, over their shoulders, there'll be a bright young Japanese watching how do they do it? When can we do it? How's it done? Everything changes. Japanese officials, prior to this opening up, of course, wore traditional Japanese dress, and that's a photograph of them. As soon as they open up, the Japanese officials start wearing Western dress. Here on the left of your slide is a senior Japanese civil servant. You'll note that he is sporting a European-type moustache, and he's wearing a morning suit and carrying a top hat. By 1895, they had an army of 250,000, about the same size as the British army at the time. It was made up of peasant conscripts, they were the other ranks, officered by the samurai. So here's a job for the samurai. So instead of the samurai all being out of work, now they've got jobs, the sort of jobs that they were brought up to do. They are the officers of this army. They've got modern weapons supplied by the Germans, and they've been trained how to use them by the Germans. They've got a modern navy trained by the British in ships built in British shipyards. And in 1894, 95, they go to war with China. And as a result of the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan takes Taiwan, Formosa, it takes a lot of the offshore islands, and it takes Port Arthur. And then the war ends. And the Japanese are certainly the victors, and they have a great deal of very useful Chinese territory. Now, when this happens, the powers who were initially encouraging Japan to industrialize so they could trade with her, they're now rather worried. Is Japan getting a bit big for her boots? And they bring pressure on Japan. It's not military pressure, but the Japanese are persuaded to give up Port Arthur. So they give up Port Arthur. And then 2 years later, a Russian fleet appears off Port Arthur, and the Chinese lease Port Arthur to the Russians, and the Russians start to fortify it. Now, to the Japanese, hang on, 2 years ago, the Russians and their chums forced us to pull out of Port Arthur, and now the very people who persuaded us to leave, the Russians, are back, and they're there. What is going on? Now, this was a time when, of course, China was weak. The British are at Weihai Wei up here. They've got a concession there, and at Tientsin up here. The Germans are down here. There's an international settlement down here at Shanghai. And of course, the British have got Hong Kong. Russia's only port on the Pacific coast was Vladivostok up here, which was built in 1860. Now, the trouble with Vladivostok is that it ices up in the winter months. It still does, but nowadays, of course, it's kept open all the year round by icebreakers. But now that the Russians have got Port Arthur, they have a port which doesn't ice up. And they start to build a railway up to Harbin, which will then connect with the Trans-Siberian Railway. This is what's known as the Chinese Eastern Railway. That's not the Trans-Siberian. Trans-Siberian Railway, as you know, goes north and then off to the west. So they're going to link Port Arthur with the Trans-Siberian Railway. And ultimately, of course, that links Port Arthur with Europe, with European Russia. The Trans-Siberian Railway, of course, as you know, it started from Vladivostok in 1891, finished in 1903, so the previous year. But there is no rail line round Lake Baikal. The crossing across Lake Baikal was by ferry. The Russians bring in 170,000 troops into Manchuria, which is this area here, ostensibly to protect the railway. Now, to the Japanese, whose army is actually pretty competent, as I say, it's trained by the Germans and armed by the Germans, the Japanese say, what is going on? As far as the Japanese were concerned, Korea was an essential to their defense. They saw Korea as being a buffer. They didn't want any potentially hostile power to be in Korea. It was a buffer. And they think, are the Russians threatening Korea? Why have they got 170,000 troops? They don't need 170,000 troops to protect the Trans-Siberian Railway. What do they have to protect it against? This, to the Japanese, was very threatening. Are the Russians thinking of taking over Korea? And if they do, is that then a springboard to try and take us? And in 1902, the Japanese signed a treaty with the United Kingdom, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty. That, incidentally, and it's another story, but that should have been renewed in 1925. But the Americans asked the British not to renew it. The British were very worried about Japanese ambitions at that particular period, but that's a different story. So the Japanese now protest to the Russians. Why? What are you doing? Why are you building a railway? Why have you got 170,000 troops in Manchuria? Now, in Russia, the Tsar was Nicolas II, the Tsar of all the Russias, the little father, appointed by God and responsible, answerable only to God. But Nicolas II was weak. He wasn't like his father. His father, Alexander III, was a strong despot, and he had the personality and the ability to be a despot. Nicholas II wasn't. He was a bit inclined to agree with the next speaker. On the one hand, he said that a war would be a good thing because it would rouse patriotism. It might quash some of the dissent that was bubbling in Russia at that time, with a increased industrialization and increased literacy amongst the working classes, the rising merchant class. The system was thought to be out of date. A lot of people wanted some sort of democracy. A lot of people wanted a system like the British system, which had a monarch, but a constitutional monarch. That's what they wanted. And of course, the Tsars were not constitutional monarchs. So on the one hand, he said, well, a war might be quite a good thing. He also at one stage says, there will be no war because I say there will be no war. And in any event, the Russians were totally contemptuous of the Japanese. This is a contemporary cartoon in a Russian newspaper. And you can see the Cossack here taking the impertinent Jap and giving him a thoroughly good shaking. How could these bunch of Asiatics, how could they possibly take on the might of the Russian Empire? And they thought anyway that the Japanese would never risk war against Russia. However, the Japanese knew that the Germans and the French, who were the natural allies of Russia, wouldn't support Russia if they came to war, in case that brought them into war with Britain. And they did not want to go to war with the British. So the Japanese knew that if there was a war, Russia would be on their own. And on the 8th of February, the negotiations broke down, largely because the Russians weren't interested. They weren't really prepared to negotiate anything. Why should they? So on the 8th of February, 1904, Japan declared war on Russia. But 3 hours before the declaration, a Japanese fleet appeared off Port Arthur, commanded by Admiral Togo. And he sent a torpedo boat attack. The torpedo boats cost threepence. And they badly damaged 2 Russian battleships, which cost millions. And they had a crack at a cruiser as well. This was regarded by the Russians as being totally unfair. And the rest of the world rather had a chuckle about it, because the rest of the world rather admired plucky little Japan hitting this great juggernaut of Russia. The Russians said it wasn't fair. This isn't cricket. Of course, the Japanese or the Russians play cricket, so that's probably not necessarily what they said. But they certainly said it wasn't fair. It was before war was actually declared. What actually happened was that the Japanese weren't deliberately trying to attack before war was declared. It was a question of communications and time zones and everything else. The Japanese fleet, Admiral Togo, thought war had been declared. Actually, it hadn't. Those naval operations, although they did damage Russian ships, they weren't really decisive. But what they did do was give the Japanese cover to land troops at Incheon, here, halfway up Korea, who advanced up and crossed the Yalu. The Yalu River is the border between Korea and Manchuria. And they also landed troops on the shores of Manchuria here. And they suffered a considerable amount of casualties to do it, and they're really huge losses. The Russians, of course, were entrenched, but the Russians were driven back, and the Japanese army advanced on Port Arthur. And in April 1904, the Japanese were besieging Port Arthur. On the one side, the Japanese army on land and the Japanese navy at sea. And the Japanese admiral, the Russian admiral commanding the fleet in Port Arthur, Admiral Wittgeft, was ordered to break out. And he said, it would be crazy to break out. I'm not going to break. I'm going to stay here. As long as I'm in Port Arthur, I'm safe with the Russian army defending me. And he was ordered to break out to Vladivostok. And again, he said, no, he wouldn't. He appealed to the Russian viceroy, who was the civilian governor of that area. The viceroy appealed to the Tsar. The message went back via the Trans-Siberian Railway. There was no telegraph. And back it came, Admiral Wittgeft, you are to break out. No bloody nonsense. You're to break out and you're to go to Vladivostok. So on the 10th of August, 1904, the fleet emerged from Port Arthur into the Yellow Sea. The Russians had 6 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 14 torpedo boats. Admiral Togo had only 4 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 18 torpedo boats. But the Japanese were in British-built ships with a navy trained by the British, and the Battle of the Yellow Sea, the Russians suffered a major defeat. Now, surprisingly, no ships were actually sunk. But the Russian fleet was so badly mauled, many of the ships were simply put out of action, although they weren't actually sunk. Admiral Wittgeft on the left there, he's killed. That was his flagship, the Tsarevich, on the right. So the badly mauled fleet flees back into Port Arthur. It's all that they can possibly do. And the siege of Port Arthur goes on. There are huge Japanese casualties getting close enough. And once they get up onto the hills here, overlooking Port Arthur, they bring up their Krupps howitzers, the artillery which they bought from Germany, absolutely modern artillery pieces, and they sink the fleet. They simply take out every ship, they shell every single ship until they sink it, then they move to another ship and they sink it, and so on. And by the 2nd of January 1905, every single Russian ship in the Russian fleet is at the bottom of the harbour. And Major General Stressel, who is the Russian commander of Port Arthur garrison, decides to surrender. He says the only point in holding out was to protect the fleet. There is no fleet. There is no point in losing men anymore, and he surrenders. And they're all photographed together. There's the Russians in their fur hats and the Japanese looking very stolid. And there's a Japanese civil servant there with a bowler hat and a moustache. General Stressel was court-martialed in his absence and sentenced to death. That was eventually actually he was reprieved and sentenced to life imprisonment instead. Now, before all this happened, the Russian view was the fleet's in Port Arthur. It isn't enough to take on the Japanese fleet, which we know is better trained, better ships. So we better reinforce it. Now, how do we reinforce it? Well, the only fleet left that could go and reinforce it was the Baltic fleet. So they decide that they'll send the Baltic fleet all the way from the Baltic, all the way around the Cape and off to the combat area. This, of course, is before they knew that the Baltic was, it's before the Baltic fleet was sunk, and they had no reason to think that the Baltic fleet, the Port Arthur fleet would be sunk. As the Baltic fleet came out of the Baltic and into the Channel, it spotted some British trawlers, fishing boats that were fishing off the Dogger Bank. And they thought they were Japanese torpedo boats. Now, how they thought Japanese torpedo boats could possibly be in the English Channel goes beyond me. The visibility, admittedly, wasn't terribly good. So they opened up on them. They sank a number of trawlers. And this very nearly brought them into war with Britain, because the British got very grumpy about Russian ships sinking their trawlers. Fortunately, the Russians, when they realized what had happened, put their hands up and promised to pay indemnity and everything else. And off they went. Now, the British would not allow them to go through the Mediterranean and through the Suez Canal. The Mediterranean was a British lake in those days, and the British controlled the Suez Canal. They wouldn't allow them to use Royal Navy coaling stations. And of course, the Royal Navy had coaling stations all around the world. So the Baltic fleet had to go all the way around the Cape. And they said to the British, look, could you possibly make an exception for our second in command of the fleet, who's a man called Admiral von Volkersam. Now, Volkersam was a Baltic German in the Russian Navy. He is very ill, and we don't want to subject him to this very difficult journey, very long journey, all the way around the Cape. Would you possibly allow him to go through the Suez Canal? So the British said, yes, we will. He can go through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, join the rest of the fleet off Madagascar, but he's got to go on a transport ship. He can be escorted by 2 warships, but they've got to be very old warships. Nothing that could possibly pose a threat to any British position, either in the Mediterranean or in Egypt. And they agree to that. And so the second in command, Volkersam, goes through the Suez Canal. Now, the poor old boy, when he connected up with the rest of the fleet, he actually has cancer and he dies. So he never gets to the final battle area. The ship that his body was in fact, later on is sunk. So his body and the ship went down to the bottom. Meanwhile, while this is all going on, while the Baltic fleet is steaming all the way round, in Mukden up here, the Russians in the north and the Japanese in the south are facing each other over a front of about 60 miles in the winter. The Russians, perhaps surprisingly, because we tend to think of the Russians as being really jacked up and fully capable of in cold weather, but to this period they weren't. They didn't have winter kit. The railway was actually, funnily enough, of very little help. And the problem was that it was still single tracked. And of course, there was the ferry across Lake Baikal. So you couldn't send wounded back and supplies coming up at the same time. You could either send it one going east to west or west to east. So it wasn't as much help as perhaps one might have thought it would be or should be. The Japanese were well dug in, and on the 20th of February 1905, the Japanese attack. They attack the Russian lines. And on the 10th of March, the Russians are getting the worst of it, and they attempt a withdrawal. And the withdrawal, which is, as all of you who have been in the services will know, the most difficult phase of war is the withdrawal. Very quickly, it can turn into a rout. And that is what happened. It was a complete shambles, a complete rout. Artillery pieces left behind, horses left behind, all kit left behind, wounded left to die. It was a great Japanese victory, but it wasn't decisive because the Japanese, of course, had taken a lot of casualties themselves, and they were in no condition to pursue. And in the meantime, the Baltic fleet has sailed 18,000 nautical miles, that's 20,625 miles, or 33,000 kilometers, to relieve Port Arthur. But Port Arthur has fallen. There's nothing to be relieved. The fleet is sunk. The Japanese have taken Port Arthur. They're in Port Arthur. So the only thing the Baltic fleet can do now is to go for Vladivostok, the Russian port. And the shortest route was through the Straits of Tsushima. The Russians were still very confident that they, despite what had happened, they didn't have to worry about the Japanese Navy. And this is again a contemporary Russian cartoon. And you can see on the right the Russian Navy, the Russian ship, giving the Japanese a jolly good punch and sinking their ship. And here's the Japanese bailing out. The flag of St Andrews, that does not mean that the entire crew was Scottish. St Andrew is one of the patron saints of Russia. St George is also a patron saint of Russia. And of course, St Andrew, as you know, is the patron saint of Scotland. So the cross of St Andrew was the flag of the Russian Navy. And of course, now also with the demise of the Soviet Union, the flag of the Russian Navy once again is the cross of St Andrew. That is what the Baltic fleet thought of the Russian Navy, of the Japanese Navy, I'm sorry. Well, how very wrong they were. Because the 27th, 28th of May, 1905, the Baltic fleet, the Russian Baltic fleet, to get to Vladivostok, decides to go through the Straits of Tsushima here. That's the quickest route to get up to Vladivostok. And the Russian Baltic fleet had 38 ships, including 8 battleships. The Japanese had 28 ships, including 4 battleships. And in the resulting battle, the Russians lost all of their battleships. All 8 battleships were sunk. 5,000 men went to the bottom. All the other ships, except for 3, were either sunk or captured. And of those 38 Russian ships, only 3, and none of them capital ships, got to Vladivostok. The Russian losses, 3 torpedo boats and 116 men. So Russia is now defeated on land and at sea. The Japanese occupy Sakhalin Island, that's up north of Hokkaido, and the Russians sue for peace. Admiral Rozhesvensky, the commander of the Baltic fleet, and 78 naval officers, including all the ship's captains that have survived, are court-martialed and sentenced to death. In fact, later on, that is commuted to life imprisonment. President Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, offers to mediate between the two powers, between Russia and Japan. And he gets the Nobel Peace Prize for so doing. Negotiations went on for the whole of August, and eventually on the 5th of September, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. Now, this is Portsmouth in Maine, United States of America, not Portsmouth in England. And the treaty says that from now on, Korea will be in the Japanese sphere of influence. And in fact, the Japanese annexed Korea in 1910. The Japanese get Port Arthur. The Japanese get the south of Sakhalin Island, so they evacuate the north. The Russians evacuate Manchuria. They take their troops away from Manchuria. But there's no indemnity. The Japanese wanted an indemnity. They wanted to make the Russians pay for the entire cost of the war, but they didn't get that. The south of Sakhalin, of course, in the Second World War, when Russia declared war on, or the Soviet Union declared war on Japan literally a few days before the Japanese surrender, and they took back the south of Sakhalin. So Russia now has the whole of Sakhalin Island. Well, the Japanese saw the Russo-Japanese War as a great victory, which it was. It was the first defeat in modern times of a European power by an Asian power. It led to, ultimately, Japanese invasion of China in the 30s. Of course, in the First World War, Japan was allied to Britain. They didn't do anything on land, but it allowed the Japanese Navy in the Far East were able to snap up German colonies mostly islands in the Far East, and it allowed the British to bring their Far East fleet back to home waters. But it encouraged the Japanese later in the 30s to invade China, and ultimately really to the Pacific War. In Russia, enormous shame and embarrassment. And of course, it only encouraged resistance to the Tsarist system. Ultimately, of course, in 1917, it leads to the two revolutions. The Germans, by the result of the Russo-Japanese War, were encouraged to assume, when they were preparing the Schlieffen Plan for their First World War, that the Russians were no threat. They didn't have to worry too much about the Russians. So rather than a war which is far away and out of sight, the Russo-Japanese War had actually consequences that were probably not realized by the participants at the time, but they did go far beyond the immediate aims of either. So that's the Russo-Japanese War. And of course, when we get into the area of Vladivostok on the wonderful Golden Eagle, which we will eventually, that of course I shall be talking about the Russo-Japanese War then, because we'll be in the area that's relevant to it. But thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Natasha.
Thank you very much. It was another wonderful presentation. As Gordon was saying, this is a type of typical lecture that he would deliver on one of the Golden Eagle Trans-Siberian journeys that goes through Vladivostok. One of which is the special journey that we're doing next year to, along the BAM line and up to Yakutsk, which Major Corrigan is kindly joining us on to do that as a guest speaker. So if you are interested in travelling with us on that, then please do get in touch. So we'll just wait for, if you do have any questions, obviously thank you for joining us all. If you do have any questions, please do send them through to us using the Q&A function, and we'll be happy to answer those. A question that came in before the lecture today was actually just to ask what your opinions were if Teddy Roosevelt didn't actually mediate between Russia and Japan. What do you think would have happened as a result of that?
I think that the Japanese would have come out of it even better. The Russians were in a state where they really couldn't understand what had happened. This is total embarrassment, total shame. I think that the Japanese would have held the whole of Sakhalin Island, I think, and they probably would have screwed an indemnity out of the Russians. The question really is whether the British might have mediated. The British, of course, had a treaty with the Japanese, but didn't get involved. Although quietly, of course, they were quite pleased to see that British-built ships were actually rather good. So they might have come in and tried to ameliorate it, but I think the Japanese would probably have ended up probably a bit better off. And of course, the hatred between the Japanese and the Russians would simply have been exacerbated. So Teddy Roosevelt did a pretty good job, actually. He had quite a problem persuading the Japanese to accept his suggestion, particularly evacuating the north of Sakhalin Island, which is in a strategic position, actually. We look where it is on the map, and also persuading the Japanese that they weren't going to get an indemnity.
And that's fair enough. And we've had another question here. What role, if any, did Korea play in this war?
None at all. Korea was a very backward country. Really even more backward actually than Japan, and Japan had always seen it as a buffer. In other words, any potential enemy, and of course the only potential enemy in that part of the world is either China or Russia. If they got into Korea, then that would worry the Japanese. So they saw it as a buffer state. They did recruit occasionally some Koreans into the Japanese army, but they were generally used not for actually fighting. They were used to sort of build roads or dig trenches, that sort of thing. And of course, eventually they annexed Korea in 1910, which of course they again lose after the Second World War.
So another interesting question has come in. How were the diplomatic and commercial relations between Japan and Russia re-established after the war had finished?
Once the treaty had been signed, then it's back to normal business, and the ambassadors, who of course were sent packing, the Japanese embassy was sent home, the Russian embassy was sent home. They of course have diplomatic protection, as indeed they still do. But once the war is over, then they're back, and faute de mieux, trade goes on. If you really need something that somebody else has got, okay, you fought a war with them, but you'll still trade with them. So it didn't take too long before things were more or less back to normal. I should just have a sip of my gin and tonic.
I was going to say, please help yourself. Well, thank you for these questions that are coming through. We'll be able to answer some more here. Question about communications, and I guess during the time of the war, the Russians that were based in Vladivostok, how would they have communicated with Moscow at that time?
Well, the problem was that people had tried to lay a telegraph all the way across Russia. It had been tried several times. An American company, who were the experts at laying telegraphs, I mean, having had to lay them in their own vast country. But they just hadn't been able to succeed. The terrain was too difficult. People chopped the poles down, all this sort of thing. So the only way they could communicate, even as late as this, was by the railway. That was the fastest way. So it took some time for messages to get to Moscow and to get back again, which of course gave the local commanders far more initiative than they would have today. I mean, today somebody sitting in Moscow, Washington, London can talk to the commander on the other side of the world in real time and tell them what to do. They couldn't then. The Japanese had a better system because they were nearer. So they could communicate, they could get information back to Edo. Oh, no, it was Tokyo. It used to be Edo, changed the name to Tokyo. It was Tokyo then. Rather more quickly than the Russians. So that was certainly a problem.
And you mentioned the railway there, obviously the Trans-Siberian Railway. Someone asked if there were any improvements made to the railway as a result of the war.
Yeah, as a result of that, they realized that I mean, the original idea of building the Trans-Siberian Railway was for defense, to reinforce Russian Far East if they had to. And they realized that actually this hadn't really worked. So the first thing they have to do is they build a rail link around Baikal, round Lake Baikal. It's the first. There are two rail links now around Lake Baikal. On our Trans-Siberian journey, we go on the old one, which is great because we have a steam train. I mean, you know this, Natasha, but perhaps some of our viewers don't. So a steam train goes on the old link, and they will allow you to get out and stand on the sort of walkway around the engine. It's great fun. But that is not normally used. Modern traffic now goes on another link. But yes, it really made them think, and they start to think about double tracking and all that sort of thing. So that was something that did come out of the war. One of the lessons that came out of it.
There's a couple of similar questions here about how well the Russian army were trained and who trained them. And also who built their ships, obviously, that were destroyed as a result of the war.
Some of their ships had been built by the British, but some time previously. They hadn't got very many modern ships. They did build them themselves. They tended to be pretty backward in naval matters. Because if you're Russia, what do you want a navy for? You don't really need a navy in a sense. It's not like the British who have to have a navy because they've got an empire to defend, and they've got trade routes to worry about, that sort of thing. That's not the case with the Russian Empire. Is all one great landmass, and you don't defend that with a navy. They did, of course, have to have something in the Black Sea. They had to have something to defend the approaches to St. Petersburg through the Baltic. But it wasn't considered particularly important. I mean, not like Britain, where the Navy was everything. It wasn't in Russia. The Russian army, it was huge. It was enormous. But it suffered from a lot of problems. First of all, it was a conscript army. So the other ranks were conscript. And if you were conscripted into the Russian army, you were conscripted for life. I mean, most countries, I mean, at this time in Germany, in the German states, of course, Germany didn't become united until 1870, but in the German states and in Germany, when they became united, compulsory service was 2 years. In France, compulsory service was 18 months. Britain didn't have compulsory service. In Russia, it was for life, you know, until you were too decrepit to be any use. The officers were a mixture. There were some who were essentially aristocrats, didn't want anything to change, had enormous power, tended to ill-treat the soldiers. I mean, if a soldier did something they didn't like, an officer would strike a soldier. They would never do that in the British Army. But there were a number of officers who had seen what was going on in Europe, and they wanted reform. You know, you'd had the Decembrist revolt, which was largely of young officers who wanted to modernize. So you've got this going on within the Russian army. Kit tended to be produced locally, not particularly good. They were quite good in defense. You know, stick a few Russians somewhere in a trench and say, you hold that. You know, it's this stolid Russian peasant attitude. But their main asset was that it was huge, a huge army, but not actually up to modern warfare, really. One of the lessons that came out of the Russo-Japanese War was, of course, that the Russian army had to modernize. So that by the time the First World War comes along in 1914, the Russian army isn't at all bad. They were certainly fully capable of fighting a short war. I mean, they weren't capable of fighting a long war, but neither was anybody else at that time. So there was something they did learn from the Russo-Japanese War, was they really had to modernize the army. They had to start thinking. And of course, they then they had a treaty. They had a treaty with France already when Kaiser Wilhelm wouldn't renew the treaty with Russia. Because they'd had a treaty which was important to Germany, because they didn't want to have to fight a war on two fronts. They didn't want to fight the French on one side and the Russians on the other. But Kaiser Wilhelm thought they didn't need that anymore. So Russia suddenly finds herself without allies. What's she going to do? Well, she has an alliance with France. So part of the modernization after the Russo-Japanese War, when they realized they have to modernize, was seeking advice from the French. So that's one of the things that comes out of this war.
Well, that was a brilliant explanation, and thank you very much for answering all of the questions that have come through. There are a few more that we don't really have time to answer at the moment, but as I said, we'll follow up with answers to these questions after today's talk. So thank you very much for sending them in, and we will get back to you with the answers for that. But sadly, we have run out of time. We really appreciate all of you joining us today, and thank you again to Major Corrigan for another wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much for listening. And if there are any further questions, I'll try and answer them by email. But thank you very much, and see you on the Golden Eagle eventually.